Everyone in my office has gone crazy and started murdering each other. I work in your classic, boring old corporate office. If you were to visit my place of work, you'd find me at my desk typing away at a computer and printing out papers for hours on end. Boring stuff. I don't have a very glamorous life, but I don't care much. All I ask for is an average life of Excel spreadsheets and browsing Reddit on my breaks are all I need to be content. I had already been disavowed to the system years before. I grew up in a traditional middle-class, working family. I knew that I was doomed to spend my adult life working away as a simple cog in the corporate machine. I had accepted my fate long before. If you couldn't tell, I haven't ever been very aspirational. I could see that my coworkers didn't share my apathy. They felt slightly uncomfortable with their position in life. There were two types. The ones like Chris, a salesman, who believed that they could eventually get out of their depressingly boring position in life. Unfortunately, Chris was turning 35, and he appears to be stuck in this life. Nonetheless, he keeps up hope. The second type of people felt more uncomfortable with their life than the first type, and so they tried to justify the feeling of hurt and injustice they felt towards their position in life by placing their trust in the hands of a higher power. Sarah was one of these people. Sarah was a devout Christian mother of 4. You could tell she didn't like how life had turned out for her, but she said she trusted and followed the plan that God had set before her. And then there was me. I suppose I may seem either narcissistic or nihilistic in my assessment of the world. Perhaps it is naive to not consider myself one of the masses. I guess I'm an adult emo. Nice. Today was anything but average. I woke up ready to face another day of slaving away for corporate, and I went about my morning routine as usual. Midway through breakfast, I was checking my phone when I noticed that I had a voicemail. I had no idea how I had missed it. I saw that it was from my division director. It went a little something like this. Hey there, James, right? Right, yeah. Hey, this is Jerome. Burp, come in for a meeting at 12:30 or so. You can take lunch after. Burp. All right, cheers. I could tell that he was drunk, very drunk. This was very shocking for me, as Jerome was the symbol of corporate pride. Jerome was the exact stereotype as someone in his position. He was a typical wannabe yuppie. His ego was immense, and wrongly so, as he probably made only a little more than the rest of the workers in our office. He wore perfectly ironed suits to work every day. His hair was always slicked back, as though his hair was still drying. Think of an upper-class Patrick Bateman. Drinking to the point of drunkenly scheduling meetings was not something you would expect from a disgustingly stereotypical corporate lieutenant like Jerome. Despite all of this, I brushed off this as nothing more than an unusual occurrence, and I continued on with my day. But when I got to work, I discovered that strange events kept occurring. Sarah, who was the secretary, seemed unusually reserved. She was always bubbly and bright. Her cheery disposition was usually a stark contrast to the apathetic feel that the office building gives off. Not today, though. She wore a long expression on her face. Her wrinkles and other indications of her age seemed more pronounced than usual. She was pale and appeared as though she was ill. It was quite concerning, actually. Usually Sarah would flash you the biggest smile you've ever seen, and then say something along the lines of, "Have a blessed day, dear," or some other cheesy Christian well-wishing. Even if you weren't a religious yourself, you feel how much love she had put behind her kind words. Today she was much different. It took her a while for her to spot me. Her desk was in disarray, which contrasted heavily to her usual obsessively neat tendencies. She was shuffling through papers when I walked by. Out of habit, I walked slower. I usually did this to hear one of her nice remarks, but she still did not notice me. Concerned, I decided to say something. "Hey, how are you doing this morning, Sarah?" I asked, putting extra cheer in my voice in an attempt to seem kinder than usual. She was taken off guard by my question. She looked around in confusion until finally she realized where I was standing and looked at me with a mildly bewildered expression. Sorry, I'm busy preparing for this afternoon's meeting, Sarah said in a zombie-like tone. I was not prepared to give up trying to talk to her so easily, so I continued on. Oh, that's a real meeting? The call I got seemed like Jerome wasn't in the best headspace. Yeah, no. She gave me a blank stare. This stare chilled me to my core. It was not the stare of a tired employee, but something much more horrific. I couldn't tell you exactly why, but the look in her eyes, or lack thereof, terrified me. Behind her cold, dead eyes, I could see nothing. It was like staring into an emotional abyss. In the practical sense, her eyes weren't unusual at all. Her eye color was normal, her pupils didn't seem dilated, and nothing was inherently odd about them. Just something seemed inhuman about them. After a solid 5 seconds of eye contact, and no words being exchanged, I gulped down the scream that was building inside my throat. Good talk, Sarah, I said before quickly walking to my desk. I got straight to work rather than procrastinating like usual, out of pure fear. After my absolutely lovely exchange with Sarah, I was just about done with human interaction for the day, so I tried my best to avoid all of my coworkers. These efforts were in vain, however, as just 10 minutes after I had set upon doing my work, my coworker, Chris, leaned over my cubicle wall to speak to me. I had learned my lesson the first time and completely avoided looking him in the eyes. Hello there, Damien, he said, in his deep, booming voice. Chris was an odd fellow. He was always the ambitious type. He figured that he could be a movie star, and he probably could, had the circumstance been right. He was incredibly handsome and charismatic, as well as dramatic. If one was to mention Chris, they would no doubt mention his speech habits. His words were carefully selected. Emotional subtext stood behind every syllable he uttered. Every inflection in his tone was chosen carefully to draw precisely the right response in your brain. I really believe that had the situation been different, he would have gone far, but the cards were stacked against him. You could blame it on a multitude of things. He was born in the wrong city. He had a family he had to provide for. He was aging. It doesn't matter what the ultimate reason for his normal life was. It was just depressingly, crushingly, heartbreakingly normal. Many of the ladies in the office would fall head over heels for him. Mostly the younger types who were temps and didn't stay long. The only person I know to have feelings for him in the past and still work at the office is me. I'm gay. At the time I had feelings for him, I was still in the closet and denying my homosexuality, so I didn't really indulge my feelings. He was straight anyway, so far as I know, so getting hung up on him seemed pointless. I got over my feelings eventually and continued on with my job. I kept to myself and tried to keep away from Chris, lest I fall again for his dangerously powerful spell. Are you prepared for today's meeting, he said, in his dream-like voice. The mention of the meeting was unusual. All that my co-workers were talking about was the meeting. They seemed feverishly obsessed. I heard some rumors as to what the objective of the meeting was, but I would be much interested in hearing yours, he said, attempting to keep up his amazing wordplay. Something seemed off, however. His swagger seemed less so than usual. His voice wavered several times, and it appeared as though he had broken character a few times throughout the conversation. It was unusual. I made my next mistake of the day. Out of shock, I looked up at Chris and I saw his eyes. My God, his eyes. One might say that he could kill with a look, but today that word had a more literal meaning. When I saw the lifelessness behind them, the same kind as in Sarah's eyes, I was immediately sick on my desk. Seeing Sarah's eyes was bad enough. Seeing the eyes of Chris was jarring, damaging. His eyes were usually so expressive, so emotional. And now they were empty, nothing. The janitor cleaned up the vomit in a mechanical manner. He got there unnaturally fast and got done just as so. I had vomited on my phone, and it had stopped working. This was very weird. Was the content of my stomach really that destructive? It didn't make sense, but fuck it. I was feeling lightheaded. I wanted to go home. You'll want to stay for the meeting today, the janitor grumbled at me. I knew better than to look up at him, but I couldn't take my eyes off his shoes as he walked away. Why would the janitor know about the meeting? Fuck. Everything was crazy. I decided that I needed to get the fuck out of there. I ran to the first floor and ran directly into the front door. I bounced back, landing on my back. I got up, confused. I tried the door once more, only to discover that it was locked. I was paralyzed with fear at that point. I stood there on the first floor for about 30 minutes. I could see no cars moving outside. The world outside seemed dead, empty. After I managed to shake off the feeling and temporary paralysis, I began to think. Was it just my office that was experiencing this? I went up to the other levels and tried all the doors on all the floors in the building. They were all locked. We were alone. I was alone. I decided that my only option was to go back to work and pray that everything would be all right, although I knew it wouldn't. Nobody acknowledged me when I walked back into the office. I didn't expect them to, considering all their other zombie-like actions today. I attempted to get back to work and keep calm. I couldn't. I used to have anxiety attacks when I was younger, but after years of consistent medication, I haven't had one in a long time. Today broke my streak. I could feel my chest tightening, as if I was having a heart attack. The feeling intensified and spread, filling my entire chest and making it feel as though it was shrinking and squeezing my innards. Then came the sweat. Oh God, I felt hot. I wanted nothing more than to remove every article of clothing I had on and jump into an ice bath. I hadn't even realized that my shaking hands were accidentally hitting the keys on my laptop. This was one of the worst attacks I'd ever had. My skin burned and itched, but I was interrupted by a weak, quivering voice. My attack seemed to subside due to the distraction. Hey, why you asked me to send you a copy of my spreadsheet yesterday, so I sent it to you. Just wanted to tell you that Rachel said. Rachel was the nervous type. She was a lot like me in many ways. She was checked out of society. She knew she couldn't change her position, but she didn't care. We had been friends since I got the job. We haven't talked in a while, though. I mistook our friendship for feelings of attraction, and so did she. Due to the suppression of my homosexuality, I really didn't understand what attraction was, and stupidly, I got into a relationship with her. We were together for about 2 years before I finally ended things. She had fallen madly in love with me, but my feelings hadn't changed much since we started dating. Sure, we strengthened our bond, but I had no strong feelings when it came to our relationship. I wasn't interested in sex at all with her, which was a major problem. Eventually, she asked me to marry her, and I didn't say no. She was beyond happy, and I was indifferent. After pushing off the wedding several times, I realized that I couldn't marry her. I realized that I was gay. She was heartbroken, but since she was the non-confrontational type, she took it quietly. I could tell that she was devastated, though. I really did love her, just not in that way. I still feel shitty for the way I treated her, so I have done my best to do whatever I can for her. Hearing her voice made me look up instinctively, despite knowing that I would once again find those cold, dead eyes. But to my surprise, her eyes were completely normal. The right amount of emotion that she usually had. She was normal. I stood up, grabbed her by the arm, and walked us to the stairwell. Do you know what the fuck is going on? I asked, trying not to shout. She inhaled and exhaled a few times before responding, and no, I'm scared. As she said the second sentence, her voice seemed to give out from under her. Tears welled up in her eyes as she looked at me, as if she was expecting me to do something. I certainly didn't know what to do, and she didn't seem like she was going to put forth any solution. Before we could come up with any solution, the janitor came out into the stairwell. The meeting is starting early. Come now, he said in a curt and gruff tone. He wasn't asking. Rachel and I exchanged a look, but realized that there wasn't anything we could do except to follow him. So we did. We followed the janitor past the sea of cubicles that made up our office and into the meeting room. I couldn't help but fear what was to come. I couldn't have expected what came next, but I knew something bad was bound to happen. The meeting was always my favorite room in the office. It had its own sort of grandeur that the other places lacked. The cubicles were mundane, and the lounge was tiny and depressing. The meeting room, on the other hand, was special. It had a large picture window built into the wall which looked out into the streets below. Perhaps my favorite part of the room was the meeting table. It appeared regal and important. I always felt a sense of entitlement when I sat at one of its chairs. It was oval-shaped, so it gave me the feeling as if I was one of King Arthur's knights. Today was different. I felt anxious looking at the room. It seemed dimly lit despite the window, and the table seemed daunting. Like I was in the principal's office after I got caught doing something bad. The table seemed so immaculately clear, apart from one paper cutter, despite there being no paper in sight. Everyone else was already sitting at the table, apart from the three of us who just entered, and Jerome, who had his forehead pressed against the window. Jerome was in shambles. His shirt was slightly untucked and bunched up in several places. His hair was a complete mess, and I could tell from the side of his face that he hadn't shaved in a while. Once we were seated, I got a good look at who else was sitting at the table. It was definitely not the entire office, not even half the office. Meetings never included the entire office, as usually they split up meetings by department. The odd thing was, no specific department seemed to be there. There seemed to be just a random selection of people from around the office. Fuck, the janitor was there even. I didn't have much time to think about this though, as Jerome turned around and started to speak. He was clearly drunk. Vomit had stained his white button-up. The company has shut down. We have all lost our jobs, Jerome shouted through tears. He then moved to the paper cutter and tore off the arm. He then proceeded to slice open his wrist, stomach, and finally, his throat. I inhaled hard. Rachel shrieked in horror. We were the only two to have a normal human reaction to witnessing their boss fucking kill himself. Rachel instantly reached for her phone, only to have it snatched out of her hand by Chris, who was sitting next to her. He threw it against the wall, hard, and it shattered to pieces. Rachel's eyes widened into perfect circles, perfectly expressing the fear she quite understandably was feeling at the moment. Chris then grabbed Rachel by the throat in his strong, firm grip and flung her across the room and into the glass window that divided the office space and meeting room. The glass was cheap, thin, and flimsy. Upon the impact of Rachel, it completely shattered. I had instinctively stood up, but I was immediately knocked to the ground by a brutal right hook, courtesy of Chris. I attempted to get back up again, but the hulking monstrosity of Chris stomped down on my upper back, completely taking the air out of me. My face was shoved into the floor, and I could slowly feel my nose being crushed, each muscle and piece of bone slowly snapping. It began at the top of my nose, and then the awful snapping of the inside of my nose made its way down to the tip. I could feel the blood gush from my nostrils. But since my face was pressed against the ground, my nostrils slowly became filled with my blood, and I began to drown in my own fluids. In an effort to not fucking die, I reached up and grabbed Chris' ankle. I pulled him forward, causing him to twist, turn, and finally fall. I could not see what had happened, as I was still on the ground, but I felt the weight lifted from my back, and I heard a loud crash. Once I had managed to stand up, I first noticed that I was the only man left standing in the meeting room. The second thing I noticed was that Chris had fallen into the meeting table. Due to its heaviness, when he fell, he took a rather terrible blow to the head. I could see the blood seeping onto the floor, and I could see a bit of gray matter seeping out from his open wound. He was clearly dead. Well, fuck. I had just killed someone. Dazed, I looked out into the office space. Everyone was fucking beating each other to death. You would be surprised at how effective of a weapon a computer cable can be made to be. I thought that everyone seemed pretty preoccupied at the moment, with the fucking beating each other to death bit, so I decided to check on Rachel. But as soon as I stepped out of the meeting room, I felt someone jump up onto my back. They were light enough, so I was able to fling them into the wall of a nearby cubicle. The wall collapsed, and I saw the janitor standing there. He had a screwdriver in hand, and he had the demeanor of someone who was ready to shank a bitch. And unfortunately for me, I was the nearest bitch. He jumped at me. He was a generally small man, standing about 5 and not weighing more than 130 pounds. He would appear to be rather frail, considering that he was rather elderly and small, but from many years of menial labor jobs, he was a force to be reckoned with. He was fast, and he was coming right at me. His knees stabbed into my chest, knocking me over. The screwdriver was thrust at my left eye, but by some miracle he missed the center. However, I did get a nasty jab right into the top of my eyelid. The pure pain combined with the knees to the chest knocked me flat onto my back. He pulled the screwdriver back up from my eye, which was now spurting blood straight into the air. Before the janitor could bring the screwdriver back down into my eye, something hit him on the side of his head, and he fell to the side. My savior continued to bash the janitor's head in with a stapler. Eventually, she was satisfied and turned to me. She reached out her hand to me. I had never been so glad to see Rachel in my life. She lifted me off the ground and immediately tore off a piece of her sweater and pressed it against my bleeding eye and created a makeshift eye patch. I wasn't worried about it obscuring my vision, as I had already lost all vision in that eye. Rachel was covered in blood, the majority of which was on her face, as when she bashed in the janitor's brains, some of his fluid sprayed out. The rest of the blood was in small cuts all over her torso and legs, no doubt from when Chris had thrown her through the window. I started. Yeah, she finished. We had both silently come to the conclusion that our best bet of escaping was making our way down to the warehouse and using the large electric door used for getting large shipments in. We looked to the door leading to the stairwell and ran toward it. We figured no one would notice, but we weren't so lucky. Just as we made it to the door, we saw Sarah running toward us. Rachel raised her blood and brain-covered stapler in defense, but to our surprise, Sarah went low. She rammed her head into Rachel's middle, tackling her into the stairwell. They were on the ground, wrestling and scratching at each other. After getting over the shock, I stepped in, prying Sarah off of Rachel. Too afraid of hurting the once innocent Sarah, I simply held her at arm's length. Rachel was much smarter than I, and she wanted revenge. She charged at her, head down, just as Sarah had done, and knocked her backwards. The railing of the stairwell was unusually low, and Sarah was pushed back so hard that she fell over. Her body flipped several times until it hit the floor with a stomach-turning splat. I didn't dare look down to the bottom for fear that my stomach would betray me. We started making our way down the steps until the intense lightness in my head began. I felt dizzy. It was from the blood loss, and I began to fall forward. My shin took a mouthful of stair, but I managed to grab the railing before my head or neck could hit the ground. We walked slower after that. It appeared that no one was following us, so we assumed it was safe to slow down. My shin was probably fractured or broken altogether, but I kept on hobbling. It had only now become apparent the amount of blood on my hands, and I shed a few silent tears of self-pity. Eventually, we made it to the bottom, and I caught a glance of Sarah's body. My stomach betrayed me. We kept on walking, although it was a bit concerning how red my vomit was. We had entered the garage and immediately noticed a large, burly man. We could tell by his uniform that he was a warehouse worker. Most likely he was a mover, as he was fucking massive. We had to use stealth to take him down. I was not nearly in the shape to walk, let alone be fast enough to sneak up on a giant like this guy. We had to turn the key on the control console to open the garage door, and the Goliath was standing right in front of the console. We could see that the key was already in the slot, and all we needed to do was turn it. I was worried about Rachel, though. Although she was very clearly an amazing and resourceful fighter, this guy looked like he could bench a small truck. She then noticed the security office. It was empty, as our security officer was on maternity leave for the next few weeks. "There's gotta be a taser or something in there," Rachel said. Her tone clearly told me that she had already made up her mind. I was feeling too weak to argue. "Here, you go in there and grab the taser. Come up on his right side. I'll draw attention to myself on the other side of him. And when he goes after me, you zap him," she said. The plan was a go. I hobbled over to the security office as Rachel went her way. It was musky, as all of the smokers in the office would sneak down to the office to get their nicotine fix whenever our security officer was gone. I began my search. I first searched through the coat the officer wore. No luck, so I then tried the desk. Bingo! I waddled back out of the office and gave Rachel the signal that I was getting in position. My hands were slippery from the blood, and the taser slipped from my hands and clattered to the ground. The sound echoed. The Goliath turned. Fuck, he looked at me. Fuck. I saw his eyes. Fuck. He began to move toward me, but before he could make it to me, I could see a hand reach the key and turn it. The large door began to slowly open. The giant then turned around and began to strangle Rachel. I could see her mouth one word: run. With tears in my eyes, I moved as fast as I possibly could to the door. A bright white light began to fill the warehouse. My legs gave out. I crawled toward the light. If I could just get a little farther, everything would be all right. I could feel myself getting lighter. I had lost a lot of blood. I was nearly there. But then, I could feel myself slipping. I fell and fell until there was only darkness. I was woken up by my alarm. I was in my bed. I could see out of both of my eyes. My nose was intact. Everything was okay. I went about my normal morning routine, and I passed it all off as some fucked up dream. But you can clearly see that I have a reason to write this. You see, midway through breakfast, I checked my phone. I had one voicemail. Hey there, James, right? All right, yeah. Hey, this is Jerome. Burp, come in for a meeting at 12:30 or so. You can take lunch after. Burp. All right, cheers.